Welcome, voyager. Tonight we wander inland, far from any coast, to a place where there was once water wide enough to cradle ships, towns, and weather, where waves curled against desert sand, and gulls cried above foam. But the sea we'll visit tonight no longer reaches the edge of its own name. This is the story of the Aral Sea, and how it was drained not by drought, but by decisions. A sea not emptied by time, but by plans drawn too straight and promises planted in cotton. They say the sea disappeared overnight, not in truth but in memory. And what's geography if not the memory of water? If your dreams often drift toward forgotten coastlines or places where maps have changed their minds, do give this channel a soft tap of like and subscribe. And as always, leave your coordinates in the comments below. If there's a vanished lake near you or a shoreline that now ends in silence, we might just follow it in a future tale. Now ease into stillness. Picture soft reeds brushing in warm wind, a wooden boat grounded on cracked clay, the hush of dust settling where tide once rose. Let that quiet widen. Let your thoughts slow to match the breath of a missing sea. Our story tonight begins in Central Asia, between what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where once the Aral Sea rested like a blue lung in the center of dry land. For centuries, the Aral Sea was among the largest inland bodies of water on Earth. Fed by two great rivers, the Amu Darya from the south and the Sir Darya from the northeast, it sprawled across the desert like a mirage made real. Fishermen sailed its currents. Towns like Minak and Aralsk flourished along its coast. In the Soviet era, its ports received cargo, its fish-fed cities, and its surface moderated the region's climate. It had no outlet to the ocean, yet it breathed like one. The seasons passed over it in shimmering layers. Pelicans nested near its shores. Children swam in its warm shallows. Its name in various Turkic languages translated to Island Sea, for its surface was studded with more than 1,000 small islets, many of which vanished and reappeared as the water shifted. It was not untouched by history. The Silk Road curved near its southern edge. Empires mapped it, misjudged it, returned to measure it again. In the 19th century, Russian explorers described it as both vast and vulnerable, ringed with shifting shorelines but steady enough to anchor trade. Then came the 20th century. In the 1960s, Soviet planners, aiming to turn Central Asia into a cotton superpower, undertook one of the most ambitious and destructive irrigation efforts ever attempted. The goal: reroute the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, and instead direct them into endless rows of cotton fields in Uzbekistan's Kizilkum Desert. The logic was agricultural. Cotton, sometimes called white gold, was a crop of strategic importance. The soil could grow it, the desert could hold it. All it needed was water, and water, after all, was plentiful, at least on paper. The engineers dug thousands of kilometers of canals, some open, some unlined, a vast network pulled from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, bleeding the rivers long before they reached the Aral. Whole towns were redesigned around cotton quotas. Water flowed where it had never flowed before. Yields rose. Cotton exports boomed. But downstream, something shifted. The sea began to shrink. At first, it was subtle. The edge pulled back by a few meters each year. Harbors required longer piers. Fishermen joked that the sea was shy. But within a decade, the joke gave way to worry, then to silence. By the 1980s, the Aral Sea had split in two. By the 1990s, its southern basin had turned to dust. Ships rusted where waves once rocked them. Entire fleets stranded on cracked salt. Wind carried not sea breeze, but sand laced with pesticide residue from decades of cotton spraying. Respiratory illness spiked. Microclimates shifted. Rain fell less often. Summer heat burned hotter. Winters cut deeper. Satellite images taken over those years read like time-lapse footage of disappearance. A blue field becomes a pale show. A waterline thins, then breaks, then recedes so far inland that once bustling ports now stood hundreds of kilometers from water. In Moynak, an Uzbek town once known for its canneries and naval schools, fishing boats were left where the sea abandoned them. Now they sit, rusting in the dust, tourist landmarks to a disaster shaped not by nature, but by policy. Some residents recall the exact day they saw no more horizon. One woman, interviewed in the early 2000s, remembered hanging laundry on her balcony and realizing that where once had shimmered water, there was only heat. No storm, no tremor, just absence. And yet, the sea didn't vanish entirely. Small parts held on. In the north, Kazakhstan, with the help of international support, constructed a dam in 2005 known as the Koch Aral Dam. It aimed to preserve what little remained of the North Aral Sea by halting the outflow and restoring inflow from the Syr Darya. And it worked. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Fish returned. Water levels rose. The climate stabilized slightly. By 2010, villagers nearby reported catching fish species not seen in a generation. Not abundance, but survival. The South Aral, meanwhile, largely continued its retreat. Today, what remains of the Aral Sea is fractured. Shallow patches of disconnected water, spread thin across a broad basin. On modern maps, the once cohesive sea is now a pale outline, often labeled Aralkum, the Aral Desert, a desert born not from drought, but from a map's decision. They named it Aralkum because it needed a name, a desert that used to be sea, a new landscape made of absence, where seashells lie beneath sand dunes and salt flats gleam like frost under morning sun. But the old names still linger. Fishermen who remained, too old to leave or too rooted to try, sometimes still call it the shore, even when they're standing nowhere near water. Memories do not shrink at the rate of coastlines. And in this place, memories are thick. The outlines of piers still extend into dust. Rusted cranes and winches tilt over empty lots. Villages built around the rhythms of tide and fish must now wait for rain and endure wind. Every structure seems turned slightly toward where the sea used to be, as if listening for it. There's something different about a sea that's been erased while people still live in its memory. It's not ancient, it's recent, intact in photographs, in smell, in muscle memory. There are men who still speak of navigating by the height of distant islands, which are now ridges in a plain. And yet, for all this loss, some hold hope. In the northern remnant, the return of water, even partially, has brought life in unexpected forms. Amphibians, waders, and shorebirds have started to reappear, not in great flocks, but in scattered signs of resilience. One researcher studying the return of species to the North Aral noted that seeds buried in lakebed silt for decades sprouted once water returned. Dormant, waiting, ready. The return is fragile. It relies on political will, sustained funding, and seasonal snowfall upriver. But it exists, and in a landscape where so much has receded, that forward motion matters. Elsewhere in the world, the Aral Sea became a symbol, not of nature's fury, but of human overreach. A cautionary tale told in environmental reports, textbooks, and satellite maps. Studied in schools, cited in water policy debates, pointed to when questions arise about river diversion, irrigation expansion, and the scale of engineered landscapes. And yet, in those distant conversations, the voices of the sea's former neighbors often feel distant, even forgotten. Their stories are quieter, wrapped in dust, spoken in regional dialects over small fires or in kitchen corners. One elder in Karadarin, Kazakhstan, once said, "We didn't notice we were leaving the sea. We noticed it was leaving us. His children now work in places far from water, but he keeps a net coiled in his yard. Not out of nostalgia, he says, but because nets don't spoil. And someday, if the sea remembers its way back, he'll know what to do. There's no promise that the Errol will return. Not fully, not even mostly, but there are lessons that continue to wash up on its dry shore. The first is that loss does not always look like disaster. Sometimes it looks like silence, like waiting, like a line on a map quietly redrawn. The second is that ecosystems are stories. Change one part and you alter the plot. In draining rivers to grow cotton, engineers reshaped not only water flow, but weather, health, trade, migration, and memory. And the third is that restoration, while rare, is possible. Even in fragments, even in slowed breath. The Coke-Errol Dam, though simple in appearance, proved something that can't be easily forgotten. That an act of repair, no matter how modest, can ripple outward. That water, if given a chance, often remembers its bed. Other nations, looking at dried lakes and shrinking rivers, sometimes cite the Errol as both warning and guide. In California, in the Dead Sea Basin, in parts of China, engineers and ecologists study what went wrong here and what might go right elsewhere. But beyond science and policy, the Errol Sea also lives on in art. Poets write of gulls with no sky to circle. Musicians record laments in the rhythms of old fishing chants. Painters render harbors full of light, though they know the hulls now rest in sand. Even Google Earth, that modern window on the planet, cannot forget it. Scroll back through the years, and the blue returns. Frame by frame, year by year, the sea pulls back in reverse, reshapes, rejoins itself. Is a digital resurrection. And yet, no photo can capture the weight of heat rising from salt flats. The crunch of dust beneath boots where there should be shore. The way air hangs differently over a place that once held tide. In Uzbekistan's west, near Nukus, a regional museum holds collections of art and photography made in the era of the sea. Old oil paintings show wharves bustling with life, water stretching behind figures with nets and knives and laughter. The contrast is stark and deliberate. Some of those who created those works have passed on. Others moved inland, but the museum continues to hold their work like a buoy in the cultural tide, letting visitors see what was, and not just what was lost, but what was real. The Aral Sea wasn't a mirage. It was vast. It had depth. It had salt. It had stories. And it had maps. Hundreds of them drawn and redrawn from the 18th century onward. Some called it Sea of Islands. Others labeled it simply Aral. And as the water shrank, the names did too. Lesser Aral, South Basin, Residual Lake. Names that seemed to apologize for the disappearance. But those early maps still exist, tucked into archives and atlases. A reminder that cartography does not prevent loss. It only records it. Our story nears its quiet end, not with conclusion, but with reflection. Because the Aral Sea did not vanish overnight. It was a slow undoing, a disappearance so gradual that those closest to it often noticed last. But maps saw it first. In satellite imagery from the late 20th century, the blue grows thinner each year. The inlets become bays, the bays become ponds, and then the ponds become outlines. In time, the coastlines once so intricate begin to resemble the weathered edges of old cloth. Frayed, brittle, unsure of where the border used to be. Cartographers updated their atlases, not with ceremony, but with corrections. The waterline redrawn each printing. By the 2000s, the Aral Sea had shrunk by nearly 90%. It had been a sea in name, in spirit, in shape, but the page could no longer pretend. And yet, even now, water remains. Inlets too shallow for boats but too wet to forget. Channels that flood in spring and vanish in summer. Pools where frogs return, their voices echoing across a basin that once roared. In the north, near the Coquerel Dam, some villagers have rebuilt wooden docks edge into a restored shoreline. A new generation of children learn to fish, though they have only stories of what their grandparents once called the real sea. These children know fish not as bounty, but as possibility. It's easy to speak of disaster in past tense, but in the Aral, the past is not distant. It moves through the air, clings to salt in the soil, rides the wind. Wheat now grows in places once underwater. Camels wander across former seabeds. And all the while, the old sea's presence is felt, if not seen. From the perspective of Earth's history, the Aral's disappearance is a blink. Lakes come and go. Rivers change course. The Sahara was once green. But what sets this apart is not the scale, but the reason. The Aral Sea did not dry because of tectonic shift or long drought. It vanished because irrigation canals leaked, because plans prioritized crops, because goals were ambitious and oversight was thin. No single person drained the sea. It was a collective erosion, decade after decade, decision after decision. A tide turned not by gravity, but by policy. But even now, there are those who walk its old shores and speak with pride. A fish returned, of efforts made, of learning through error. In Kazakhstan, there are small schools where children are taught not just what was lost, but how not to lose it again. And that is perhaps the softest kind of recovery, not only of land, but of awareness. Some evenings, when the wind is still, the light low, and the ground still holds the heat of the day, locals say you can almost hear the old sea, not in a mystical way, but in the quiet hush of sand shifting, the occasional creak of a stranded hull cooling in the dusk, the way your foot sinks, just slightly, into soil that once knew waves. It's an echo of motion, an outline of memory, and while the sea itself may never fully return, its lesson lingers. In other parts of the world, lakes are shrinking, rivers run slower, glaciers fade. The planet changes in large, sometimes invisible ways. But the Aral reminds us that loss can be measured not just in depth, but in intention. That it's not just the absence of water, but the presence of choices that defines a place. And that somewhere, even in the driest basin, a reed might sprout, fish might return, a net might be cast once more. Tonight, as you rest, picture that flat expanse where waves once danced, the wooden skeletons of boats resting in rows, the soft rustle of reeds in a breeze too gentle to measure. Imagine placing your hand on cracked clay still laced with salt, listening to the quiet not as emptiness, but as rest. Let your breath fall into rhythm with that silence. Let the stillness carry you. The Aral Sea did not vanish in a storm. It went softly, and perhaps in time some of it will come softly back. Not in flood, but in forgiveness. Sleep well now, voyager. The tide may be gone, but the story still moves. And sometimes the quietest waters run deepest. Good night. Welcome back, Voyager. On our second story of the night, we find ourselves walking along the edge of a map, one that might be upside down, or perhaps just turned the way it once was meant to be. Because for many centuries, East wasn't always to the right, and Alexandria didn't always sit facing forward. This is the tale of a city that was always in the right place, but never quite facing the right way. Of maps drawn backwards, coastlines leaning the wrong direction, and a world that made sense, just not to modern eyes. You could say this episode is a bit disoriented, but to be fair, so was half of ancient cartography. Before we set sail, if your dreams tilt eastward or you've ever tried folding a map back up only to give up entirely, go ahead and like and subscribe. And let us know your coordinates in the comments below. If your corner of the world once showed up reversed, stretched, or mysteriously absent on a map, we'd love to explore it in a future story. Now, settle in and let the wind blow softly through paper curtains. Picture a breeze coming from the east, even if you're not quite sure where east is anymore. Let the compass spin slowly to sleep. Let the ink settle, and let us begin. Our story tonight starts in Alexandria, around the 2nd century AD, in a time when the city was still young, still glittering from its inheritance of empire, and still known as the seat of knowledge for nearly all who read and reasoned. Alexandria, seated on the northern edge of Egypt, wasn't just a port city, though it had one of the finest harbors in the Mediterranean. It was a library, a lighthouse, a lens through which the ancient world tried to understand itself. Here, scholars from across the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian worlds gathered to ask questions few others dared to write down. And among those minds was Claudius Ptolemy, a mathematician, astronomer, and geographer. Ptolemy lived and worked in Alexandria during the reign of the Roman Empire. Though little is known about his personal life, the legacy of his work spans continents and centuries. His book, the Geographia, was one of the first known attempts to capture the known world not in myth or story, but in coordinates. He listed over 8,000 places, each with a latitude and longitude, based not only on earlier records, but on astronomical observations and reports from sailors and travelers. But here's the twist. Ptolemy's maps faced south. To modern eyes, this seems like a mistake. But in Ptolemy's worldview, and in much of the ancient Near East, orienting a map with the south at the top and the north at the bottom made perfect sense. After all, the Nile flows northward, and the sun, for most of the day, appears to arc across the southern sky. What we think of as up was to many simply arbitrary. In fact, the word Orient itself comes from the Latin oriens, meaning east. Early Christian maps often placed east at the top of the page, symbolizing the rising sun and Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the world. So Ptolemy's south-facing maps weren't mistakes. They were mirrors of a world that hadn't yet agreed on how to look at itself. But the implications of this reversed geography were immense. Over time, as his writings were copied and recopied, sometimes translated, sometimes mistranslated, his coordinates and worldview bent the known world into new shapes. Arab scholars, who preserved Ptolemy's works through the Middle Ages, often reinterpreted the orientations. And when European cartographers rediscovered Geographia in the Renaissance, many found themselves puzzling over coastlines that curled the wrong way and cities that seemed to sit on their sides. One of those cities was Alexandria. Despite being one of the best-known ports of antiquity, Alexandria often appeared on maps either mirrored, misplaced, or, in the case of some medieval charts, tucked behind Cairo entirely. This wasn't due to secrecy or conspiracy. It was simply the math of misunderstanding. Ptolemy's longitudes were off. His prime meridian passed through the Canary Islands, not Greenwich. His estimates of the Earth's circumference were too short, which stretched places too wide. And his 0 point, where east began, varied depending on the copyist, which meant that Alexandria, that luminous beacon of early geography, was for centuries misrepresented by the very man who tried most earnestly to place it. And yet, Ptolemy's influence endured. For hundreds of years, his coordinates were the gold standard, even when his maps were wrong. Sailors set their bearings by his grids. Explorers tried to locate lands by his angles, and when the age of discovery came, many expeditions relied on versions of the world shaped by his vision. Christopher Columbus, for instance, carried maps based partly on Ptolemaic geography, which helps explain how he misjudged the width of the Atlantic and believed he had landed near Asia. So Alexandria's backward place on early charts wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a global pattern of mirrored misplacements. Japan sometimes appeared facing west. The southern tip of Africa curved the wrong way. Even the concept of longitude, so central to navigation, remained poorly understood until the 18th century. But Alexandria kept glowing through the fog of cartographic confusion. The city itself endured plagues, sieges, earthquakes, and conquest. Its lighthouse, once considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, toppled after centuries of standing watch. Its great library burned, not all at once, but in parts over years until its shelves stood silent. Still, Alexandria remained, and so did its role as a symbol of both knowledge and uncertainty, a place where the pursuit of clarity often revealed deeper complexity. A city drawn sideways for so long that it became a metaphor for all maps, beautiful, useful, but always slightly unsure. By the time the Enlightenment rolled in, and European thinkers began standardizing cartographic conventions, Alexandria's orientation, along with the rest of the world, began to settle into the upright order we know today. North at the top, south at the bottom, west to the left, east to the right. Lines of latitude curved into bands, longitude stretched clean across the globe, and Alexandria finally faced the correct way, or rather, the modern way. But the shift wasn't instantaneous, nor uniform. Some early Renaissance maps still tilted the Mediterranean, stretching it into long ellipses that favored familiar coastlines and compressed unknown ones. Alexandria often appeared in different places, depending on which older source the mapmaker trusted most. Even as mapmaking became more precise, the echoes of Ptolemy's errors lingered, like ripples from a dropped stone. And in a sense, those ripples helped shape how Europe imagined the East, not only geographically but culturally. The Orient, as it came to be called in European literature and art, was not just a place but a concept. It was exotic, distant, and often backward, quite literally, on maps. Alexandria, with its oblique placement and mirrored past, became part of that mental geography. A city seen through translation and distortion, always intriguing but seldom understood on its own terms. Travelers came looking for ruins, papyrus, relics of ancient knowledge. What they often found was a living city that bore little resemblance to their mental maps. A place where languages braided in the streets, where Coptic, Arabic, Greek, and French coexisted in rhythm, where shadows fell across colonnades, and booksellers still opened shop beneath crumbling lintels. Even today, the real Alexandria hums softly beneath its reputation. The lighthouse is gone, but its stone base remains submerged beneath the harbor, studied by divers and archaeologists. The old library, though destroyed, has been symbolically reborn in the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a sweeping modern complex designed to mirror the open knowledge once lost to fire. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the city is not its lighthouse or library, but the way it taught people to imagine space, to question direction, to realize that up and down on a map are choices, not truths. In the southern hemisphere, for instance, school children sometimes grow up with maps that place Antarctica at the top. Australia looms large in the center, and the Americas slant to the right. These aren't errors, they're perspectives, just like Ptolemy's south-up maps were. In fact, some modern cartographers and educators advocate for south-up maps as a way to challenge ingrained hierarchies in geography. By flipping the world, They remind us that orientation often reflects power as much as position, that what's north on a map has often been, historically, the cultural or political center of the mapmaker's world. In that sense, Alexandria, always slightly askew, becomes a quiet teacher, not in doctrine but in example, because maps, for all their precision, are ultimately human. They carry intentions, biases, and limitations. They can include or exclude. They can show borders that no longer exist, or miss entire peoples who've lived for centuries in plain sight. And Alexandria's maps, those Ptolemaic grids, copied and mistranslated and reimagined, remind us of the fragility of knowledge when it tries to freeze the world in ink. Even as we zoom through satellite imagery today, watching coastlines in real time, glaciers receding, cities expanding, tectonic plates nudging rivers out of old beds, we are still making maps the way we always have, by choosing what to show, what to leave out, and what to place in the center. Ptolemy chose Alexandria. He placed it prominently with coordinates just slightly off. He gave it size, importance, dignity, and in doing so, he ensured that, for centuries, mapmakers would keep returning to this curious corner of the Mediterranean, trying to straighten what had once been lovingly tilted. And maybe there's something comforting in that for all our striving toward accuracy, some parts of the world will always sit at a slant, just enough to catch the light differently, just enough to be remembered. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine holding one of those old scrolls or atlases, the kind printed on vellum or inked by hand. Smell the faint must of time baked into the pages. Let your fingers trace a coastline that curves just a little more than it should. Let your gaze rest on Alexandria, sitting there on the edge of Africa, looking out not quite north, not quite south, and picture the waves lapping the shore as they always have, uncaring of longitude. Our journey draws toward the quiet end of the parchment, but not before we take one more long, slow look at this mirrored city and the way it shaped the lines we follow today. Alexandria is still a city of questions. Excavations near the harbor continue to reveal statues, columns, even whole courtyards beneath the waterline, not lost to myth but to time, and the way time rearranges the shore. Earthquakes in the 4th and 14th centuries, compounded by rising sea levels, pulled much of the old city under the tide. Divers map submerged sphinxes now, not because they're hidden, but because the sea has become part of the archive. A map drawn today would need to reach below the waves to show what Ptolemy never could. And still, in quiet moments, the harbor gleams with that same strange light, especially in early morning, when the sun rises over the water, casting long beams toward the city's bones. In those hours, the compass feels less urgent. The call to orient things north, south, left, right falls away. What matters is that you are standing in a place that once tried to hold the entire world in its arms, that tried to measure it, name it, draw it, even if a little sideways. Maps, in the end, are not just tools for direction. They are reflections of the people who made them. You can see a civilization's values in what it centers, what it enlarges, and what it omits. Sometimes a map reveals more by what it gets wrong than what it gets right. For Ptolemy, placing Alexandria near the top of the known world wasn't arrogance. It was where he stood. It was the lens through which he observed everything else. And perhaps we all build maps like that even now, sketching from memory, anchoring our sense of space from familiar shores, turning places we've never been into dots and lines, until one day we visit and discover how different the real world feels underfoot. The funny thing is, even when Alexandria was drawn correctly, even when north was placed at the top and every line lined up, people still got lost in its streets. The old city was a grid, but time softened its angles. Alleyways wandered. Old walls gave way to gardens. The breeze off the harbor took shortcuts. so maps could never quite contain it, only suggest its outline. Perhaps that's why it keeps drawing people in. It invites you to orient yourself not just to a place but to a way of seeing. One that allows for reversals, that accepts a little tilt, that trusts memory even when the coordinates shift. And as you drift tonight, you might think of your own map, the one you carry quietly behind your eyelids, not inked or printed, but felt. A map of sounds, smells, the curve of places you've walked, the sense of where the light comes in a room. A personal geography drawn again each time you remember. And somewhere on that map, perhaps there's a city like Alexandria, tucked at the edge of land and thought, slightly askew, beautiful in its imperfection, facing whichever way makes the most sense from where you are now. So rest easy, voyager. Let the compass needle slow. Let direction soften. Let your dreams wander without correction. Because the world is not only wide, it is turning. And sometimes all it takes to find your place in it is to look again, just a little differently. Good night. Welcome, voyager. On our third story of the night, we hold a shell to our ear, and instead of the sea, we hear something older. Not the rush of tide, but the echo of stars. A shell, round and pale, smooth like worn stone, cradled once in a child's hand somewhere in the Pacific. It might seem like nothing more than a trinket, something left behind by a wave, but to the people who carved memory into water, it held maps. Not maps of ink and paper, but of wind and current, of moonlight and coral, of constellations passed from voice to voice. This is the story of how some children, long before coordinates or compasses, learned to find islands by tracing the ridges of a shell, and how those same shells, tucked into the folds of bark cloth or net bags, carried knowledge across thousands of miles, as quietly as breath. Before we dive in, if you've ever tried folding a paper map only to give up and use your phone, consider dropping us a like and subscribe. And do leave your coordinates in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. If the stars look different from your side of the sea, we'd love to feature your sky in a future tale. Now ease your shoulders into the soft weight of rest. Let your thoughts slow like waves between tides. Picture a breeze, not rushing, just wandering, across a moonlit shore where palm fronds whisper. Imagine a shell in your hand, cool and perfect, with ridges like soft mountain ranges. Inhale, exhale, let the sea come to you. Our story tonight begins in the open waters between Micronesia and Polynesia, in a time when islands were not points on a chart, but notes in a remembered song. There is an archipelago called the Caroline Islands, stretched across the central Pacific. Scattered like breadcrumbs, they are small, some no more than specks of sand and mangrove, but to the master navigators who sailed among them, they were familiar as neighbors. This region, thousands of kilometers across, was once crossed by outrigger canoes made of breadfruit wood and lashed with coconut fiber. The people who sailed them used no metal tools, no sextants, no written logs. And yet, they could find a single atoll the width of a river delta in the middle of an ocean wider than continents. Their navigational tradition is known today as wayfinding, and while it varied from island to island, one of the most extraordinary centers of this knowledge was found in the tiny island of Seagulls, in the Federated States of Micronesia. Here, knowledge passed orally through generations in a lineage of master navigators called Po. Entry into the Po was sacred. It required long apprenticeships and ceremonial commitment. And central to their training was the art of attack, a method of navigation not just by direction, but by relationships between reference points, including islands you couldn't even see. A navigator might say, "We are not moving, the island is." In this worldview, the canoe stayed still and the world rotated around it. Stars rose, fell, and circled. Swells came from specific directions, marked by the pattern of distant storms. Birds flew at dawn and dusk, always with purpose. The rhythm of the ocean itself, long swells from one direction, short chop from another, became a kind of sentence to be read by the knees and feet. Children didn't learn this from diagrams. They learned it in stories, in chants, in practice, and sometimes in shells. Cowrie shells, common across the Pacific, are small and ovate, with ridged backs that feel like folded time. In some traditions, they were used to teach basic navigation and star paths. Older navigators would sit with children and lay shells in the sand to mark islands, currents, and waypoints. The arrangement might look random to an outsider, but it carried a logic built on wave memory and celestial rhythm. Each shell might represent a known island or a place of reef break. The gaps between them marked distances not in kilometers, but in the number of star risings or sleeping tides it would take to reach them. There are records, in both oral tradition and anthropological study, of star compasses being carved into the minds of learners through physical objects. The cowrie became a stand-in for home. Other shells might form arcs around it, showing where the rising of Sirius or Antares would point. In this way, the cosmos became tactile, mapped not across space, but within story and touch. One preserved example comes from the island of Puyuhuat. A man named Maupielug, often called the last master navigator, shared his knowledge with both scholars and future generations. He taught that each star had its rising and setting point on the horizon, and these became directional guides. By memorizing the sequence of which stars appeared at which times, a navigator could hold a route in his head, tracing a journey without needing to see the land. And in early training, children were taught to mimic these arcs using small shells. The action of placing them in order, repeating the names of stars, whispering the distances, was more than play. It was apprenticeship. Cowries were sometimes sewn into belts, into mats, or kept in pouches, their meaning hidden to outsiders but deeply known to those who carried them. This kind of knowledge, rooted in movement, is difficult to capture in written form. Western navigation separated observation from feeling. It relied on measurements, but Pacific wayfinding combined them. It read swells by the rhythm of canoe slaps. It recognized distant land by the way clouds built over heat. It heard the song of a reef long before it saw its foam. And the shell? It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a classroom. In the spiraled grooves of a cowrie shell, one could trace a path not unlike the turning of stars across the night. A master navigator could place it in a young sailor's palm and speak softly of constellations, currents, and ancestral paths. The child would feel the ridges, close their eyes, and listen, not to the shell itself, but to the voice that brought it to life. Some called it a form of memory mapping. Others simply called it listening. Among many island cultures, shells were not only symbols of trade or beauty, but of transit. The very texture of a shell, smooth yet coiled, hinted at directionality and return. In parts of Kiribati, elders spoke of the shell spiral as resembling the movement of currents around atolls. The shell had no corners, no straight lines, just a gentle sweep, mimicking the rhythm of the sea. When a canoe cut across swell lines, the sensation underfoot was not unlike tracing those ridges. Left, right, center, forward again. Some training mats used to teach navigation were stitched with shells to indicate particular rising stars or invisible islands. To an untrained eye, these mats looked decorative, woven with arbitrary pieces of sea-polished bone and shell. But a student might be asked to sit on the mat at sunset and recite the names of 20 stars in the order they would rise, then point to the shell that marked the setting point of each. It wasn't a test, it was a rehearsal. Repetition laid the route deeper in memory. Mao Pielug once said that the canoe was his mind and the ocean his book. He had learned from his grandfather and uncles not only by being told, but by being taken. Real journeys were the final school. But long before those, there were shells. They were props in stories and guides on the sand. Children would practice with their toes, drawing arcs around cowries, naming the horizon in all its divisions: north, south, east, west, and the 20-some named houses of the stars between. These weren't just compass points. They were relational zones. Each house of the horizon had specific stars assigned to it, and each voyage followed a course that moved through those houses. When the stars shifted, the canoe's position was recalculated not by numbers, but by song. Every journey was a chant, a set of verses tied to the stars, the wind, and the memory of those who had gone before. In this way, even the youngest passengers aboard a canoe carried part of the map within them. By the time they were ready to sail alone, the shell had already given them their first bearings. Western scholars were slow to understand this. When early anthropologists visited the islands in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they often dismissed these navigational tools as folklore. They saw shells as toys, songs as distractions, and verbal maps as too subjective to be useful. What they missed was the precision encoded in performance. A young boy on Satawal might not be able to read a European chart, but he could guide a canoe across 400 nautical miles of open ocean using only memory, the stars, and a handful of cowries. In 1976, this knowledge gained broader attention when Mao Pielug helped sail a Polynesian double-hulled canoe, the Hokulia, from Hawaii to Tahiti without instruments. The voyage, meant to demonstrate the validity of ancient navigation techniques, stunned modern sailors. Pielug used no compass, no GPS, and no maps. Only the sky, the swell, the feel of the boat, and the routes remembered from stories. He was one of the last trained navigators of his generation, but through efforts like this, the knowledge has begun to pass again, this time not only through families, but through schools and cultural revival movements across the Pacific. Wayfinding, once dismissed, is now studied and taught again, both within island nations and in institutions abroad. And shells, once used to train children in quiet moments at dusk, are still used in some teaching circles today. They're not always cowries now, sometimes they're buttons or marked stones, but the principle remains. A shell is a placeholder for a place you cannot yet see. It is a reminder that knowledge often begins not with a book, but with an object held in the palm, quiet and curved. Among the Marshall Islands, there's another navigational tradition involving rebelibs, stick charts made of thin coconut midribs and cowries tied at intersection points. These charts, unlike European maps, weren't used during the voyage. They were studied beforehand, in private, usually in the shade of a canoe house or beneath a tree, often by firelight. Each arc of a stick represented ocean swell patterns between islands, each shell a landfall. The navigator memorized the patterns, the crossings, and the rhythm of wave interactions. The chart wasn't taken aboard because the knowledge had to live inside the body. In a way, this too is a kind of shell, an object not meant to last forever, but to train the senses, to make memory tactile. And so, whether through the spiral of a cowrie, the lattice of a rebelib, or the soft voice of an elder pointing at stars rising behind palm silhouettes, these islands preserved a way of knowing that didn't require the sea to be seen, only heard, felt, and remembered. And when a child traced their finger along a shell's spine, it wasn't just the ocean they were learning. It was lineage. It was presence. It was the knowledge that everything, even the stars, could be learned through touch. To those who still practice traditional wayfinding today, a shell remains more than a symbol. It represents not just a beginning, but an ongoing practice, a reminder that orientation is not only about where you are, but how you move through what surrounds you. The stars shift overhead, the wind hums a slightly different note, and the sea rearranges its surface with every passing hour. The map never stops moving, so neither does the mind of the navigator. A modern student of wayfinding, trained under the legacy of Pielug and his followers, once described the process of learning to sail by starlight as something akin to listening with your whole body. Sitting cross-legged inside a canoe at night, eyes lifted to the sky, they could feel the hum of current beneath the hull, and match the sway of the vessel to the rise of Orion's belt or the descent of Canopus. But before they could do that, they had to sit in silence, reciting star names while fingering the shells stitched into their teaching mat. That mat, more than any digital simulator or printed manual, was their first compass. In the Western oceanic world, this deeply embodied practice sometimes struggles to find a foothold among satellite data and weather models. Yet quietly it persists. On islands like Yap, Satawal, and Pohnpei, ceremonies still honor the old navigators. Some voyages are still plotted not on screens, but in shared memory. And some children are still taught that the first map they will ever use is small enough to fit in a hand. Shells, in this context, serve a purpose similar to an heirloom. They are passed down with reverence. Their stories accumulate with time. Some bear scratches from being dropped on coral beaches. Others are worn smooth by fingers that trace them every day for years. The line between object and story disappears, until all that remains is practice, wrapped inside a gesture. In many parts of Polynesia, constellations themselves have names different from the Greek or Latin labels we might recognize. The canoe constellation, Te Waka o Te Meredi, spans parts of the Milky Way. It's not simply a grouping of stars. It's a symbolic reminder of the great voyages that carried people across the Pacific. As a navigator recites the stars in order of their rising and setting, they are retelling not just a map, but a history of migration, of adaptation, and of return. When Europeans encountered these vast oceanic regions, they often assumed them to be scattered and isolated. They didn't understand how the people could be so intimately connected. It's now known that Polynesian navigators reached every corner of the triangle formed by Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa long before Western explorers set sail from Europe. These feats were not accidents or flukes. They were deliberate, trained, and remembered. And shells were there the whole time, quietly watching. It's difficult to say whether any one shell survives from those early voyages, tucked in some museum drawer or private home. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the act of holding one, turning it slowly in your palm, continues. Teachers still use them. Students still respond. And somewhere in the dark, a canoe still moves across the sea with no engine, no map, only the sky and a mind attuned to its motion. It's been said by some elders that the ocean speaks, but only when the wind stops. That's when you can feel the subtle crossings, the place where one swell intersects another, or where the water loses its rhythm and you know an island is near. In those moments, navigation becomes less about seeking and more about recognizing. And sometimes all it takes to prepare for that recognition is the quiet study of a cowrie shell under starlight. Long before coordinates, before grids and datums, the Pacific was already mapped in full. It was mapped in memory, in chant, in the glint of stars mirrored on still water. The maps were not meant to be perfect, they were meant to be alive. And a shell, with its spiral interior and ocean-worn ridges, could be just enough to begin. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift, you might imagine holding such a shell in your hand, smooth and firm, fitting perfectly in the curve of your fingers. You might imagine tracing its ridge with your thumb, as a child might, while listening to someone speak of stars. The room quiets, the light softens, you feel the breeze shift, gently. There is no need to move. The islands will come to you. Picture the sky above you, not with named constellations, but with remembered paths. A string of lights rising one after another, each a whisper of direction. A chant forms softly in the background, not with lyrics you recognize, but with rhythm your body begins to understand. Now the shell feels warmer in your hand. It has weight, not from its mass, but from the journeys it has represented. With your breath slowing, you begin to understand how a simple object can carry an entire ocean inside it, not by volume but by meaning. The ridges are no longer random. They are the wind, the stars, the space between islands. Let that image settle with you as you drift. Let your thoughts spiral like the inner fold of a shell, turning inward, soft and slow. The ocean is wide, but you are not lost in it. You are held, guided, remembered. Good night. Welcome, Voyager. On our final journey of the night, we drift where the sea once shimmered like stained glass, and where the sky was not merely above, but reflected below, in waves that scholars once swore held secrets written in starlight. This is a story of Renaissance cartographers, of philosophers and sailors who believed the ocean mirrored heaven, not just in calmness or hue, but in structure, motion, and purpose. To them, the map of the sky was the same as the sea, and so they navigated the unknown not just by stars, but with a kind of sacred symmetry. Direction, for them, was not simply compass and chart, but faith in the sea's reflection of the divine. Now, before we set sail, if you find yourself often adrift with us across these sleeping seas, don't forget to like and subscribe, and share your coordinates in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. If a tide once turned strangely near your shore, or if a lighthouse near you held its light a bit too steady, we'd love to trace that path in a future tale. Now let the day fall away. Let your eyes grow heavy like sails in windless air. Feel the quiet hush that settles where sky meets sea. A flicker of flame, a blanket drawn higher. Let the waters around you calm. Let your thoughts slow, as if the stars above have paused to reflect. Our story tonight sets sail in the late 15th century, in the libraries of Venice and Lisbon, where parchment curled under candlelight and men in wool robes argued not just about land, but about stars. To understand how the sea became a mirror, we must begin with how it became a canvas. The Renaissance was a time of return to classical thought, to ancient geometry, to the belief that the universe was constructed with intention. The earth was a sphere, and so was the sky. The stars were arranged in order. Every planet followed a path. And if the heavens were drawn with such care, surely the oceans below must carry echoes of that same design. This belief was not entirely new. Even in antiquity, Ptolemy had mapped the Earth with celestial bearings, using star positions to estimate latitude. Arab cartographers refined this, weaving astronomy with geography, mapping the desert and sea alike by watching the heavens. But in the Renaissance, this idea became more than science. It became philosophy, theology, navigation born not just of observation, but of reverence. Maps of the age were drawn with elaborate compass roses, often centered not on a physical place, but on symbolic poles, Jerusalem, for instance, or the Garden of Eden. Around these, Radiating lines divided the map into sectors that mimicked the sky's division into astrological houses. Some cartographers filled ocean space not with voids or wave marks, but with constellations, as if the sea too had a zodiac beneath its surface. One of the most famous examples appears in the 1504 Cantino planisphere, a world map smuggled from Portugal and now housed in Italy. On it, the oceans are laced with wind roses and directional lines that match the 12 winds of classical thought, winds believed to correspond not just to weather, but to planetary influences. Sailors, when trained in these traditions, were taught to align their paths not only with the trade winds, but with the heavenly alignments believed to favor certain directions. You did not sail south simply because the wind allowed it. You sailed south when Jupiter watched favorably from above. To Renaissance thinkers, this wasn't superstition, it was natural philosophy. The earth and sky were believed to be reflections, and the ocean the most literal of those mirrors. Its tides were governed by the moon, its moods by the planetary sphere. In some circles, it was believed that storms echoed celestial conflict, and that calm seas under starlight were evidence of the cosmos in balance. There's a letter, dated 1495, from a Florentine sailor named Matteo di Forli, addressed to a patron in Genoa. In it, he writes, "The sea tonight lies so still that I believe the stars would see themselves and blush. We sail not on water, but on heaven folded." It's the kind of romantic flourish typical of the age, but it also shows us something real, the belief that what lay above could be traced in what lay below. This belief informed how maps were drawn, how voyages were planned, and how meaning was made of oceanic mystery. For mariners heading west into the Atlantic, toward lands not yet confirmed, the heavens offered both comfort and caution. They studied the alignment of the North Star with the curvature of the horizon, and measured its height with simple instruments like the astrolabe or crossstaff. But beneath the numbers, they carried a deeper conviction that these stars did not just help you find your way, but were the way. It's worth noting that Renaissance maps, particularly nautical charts, often contained two kinds of information layered atop one another. One was practical, depth soundings, coastal outlines, known hazards. The other was symbolic, wind gods, angels, orbs of light, sunrises where none had been seen. These elements weren't artistic whimsy. They were the visual echoes of the belief that every journey across the sea was also a journey through the heavens. The famed cartographer Johannes Royce, whose 1507 map includes both the newly charted Americas and fragments of mystical geography, layered constellations above the equator while mirroring their patterns in the shapes of islands and currents. To Royce and his contemporaries, a ship sailing west did not only follow the trade winds, it followed the arc of Sagittarius, or the curve of Pisces, plotted in both sky and sea. And so, at night, when the stars brightened and the winds dropped, sailors would sometimes speak of the ocean glowing with their reflection. Bioluminescence helped, of course. Tiny marine plankton lighting up in the wake of oars, but to the mind steeped in Renaissance logic, this wasn't biology. This was proof, a sign that the sea watched the stars and remembered them. This belief in cosmic reflection was not confined to Europe. In the Indian Ocean, Arab and Swahili sailors had long practiced celestial navigation with remarkable precision. The pole star, Al-Qutb, served as a fixed guide, and its elevation above the horizon provided a consistent reading of latitude. But beyond this utility, Islamic scholars in ports like Zanzibar and Muscat drew metaphysical parallels between the heavens and the sea, framing both as layers of divine order. The Quran speaks of 7 heavens layered above, and some cosmographers posited that the ocean's depths mirrored those layers, inverted beneath the earth. When Renaissance Europeans encountered these navigational systems, they were often startled by their sophistication. It was not uncommon for Portuguese captains sailing along the East African coast to rely on local pilots who navigated without visible tools, charting the stars by heart and adjusting sails with a kind of innate rhythm that seemed mystical to those raised on compass and quadrant. The idea that the sea held more than hazard, that it held pattern and purpose, echoing the sky, was affirmed again and again in encounters like these. But nowhere was this idea more visual than in the Mediterranean port of Venice. By the early 1500s, the Venetian state sponsored mapmakers whose charts became famous not only for their accuracy, but for their artistry. The so-called Portolan charts, richly colored and edged with compass roses, portrayed the sea as a grid of intersecting paths, radiating outward like rays from a divine center. In these designs, you can almost feel the influence of religious geometry, the belief that every direction was not just a bearing, but a meaning. There is a story, half remembered in the writings of a monk named Anselmo in 1511, that Venetian mariners believed if they could follow a precise spiral of bearings, each line matched to a star and a time of night, they would eventually circle back to the moment of creation. This was less a practical route than a devotional act, a kind of sailing prayer. The sea, in this view, was not something to conquer, but something to listen to, a script written in waves that mirrored the movement of stars. We might smile at such a notion now, accustomed as we are to data and engines and global positioning. But the Renaissance mind found no contradiction between observation and belief. In fact, it insisted on both. Galileo's telescope and Da Vinci's anatomy sketches existed in the same world where mariners lit votive candles before launching and traced their paths not just with instruments, but with intention. There are surviving maps from this era that show imagined lands, Terra Australis, Antilia, even the Fountain of Youth, drawn not because they had been seen, but because their presence made the map feel complete. To Renaissance cartographers, absence on a map was more troubling than invention. If the sky was so full of detail, surely the sea must be, too. Leaving part of the ocean blank was like admitting that God had made a mistake. And so, many filled it with stars turned sideways or inscriptions borrowed from ancient texts, or simply the word hic sunt dracones. Here be dragons, not as warning, but as placeholder. The stars helped fill those gaps. Their predictability, their seasonal return, became a kind of scaffolding on which to hang the unknown. You may not know what lay west of the Azores, but if Orion rose just before dawn and the moon climbed after it, then you could trust your course. The sea beneath you might churn, but the sky stayed steady. In that symmetry, sailors found calm. This idea found poetic expression in logbooks and journals. One Spanish pilot, writing in 1533 while approaching the Cape Verde Islands, described how the ocean cradled the stars on nights of calm. He claimed that certain constellations could be seen reflected so clearly that men leaned over the side of the ship to watch them ripple. He wasn't the only one. Logs from Dutch ships in the East Indies contained similar references to mirror nights, when the sky seemed to float on the water's surface. These weren't hallucinations, they were observations given meaning by belief. In these moments, the practical and the mystical merged. Navigators might read the stars to plot a course, but the experience of seeing the heavens reflected in the sea gave them a sense of reassurance. If the stars were where they should be, and the ocean still recognized them, then surely the ship would not lose its way. The world, however wide, still held shape. Even ship design took on symbolic aspects. The shape of certain hulls, long and narrow with upward curving prows, was said to mimic the arc of the crescent moon. Sailcloth was sometimes dyed to reflect constellations, especially for ceremonial ships. And in the case of Portuguese naus, the large lateen sails were occasionally decorated with sunbursts or star shapes, intended not just for visual grandeur, but as talismans of orientation. We now know that ocean currents and trade winds have their own complex patterns, and that weather systems follow logic independent of starlight. But during the Renaissance, the boundaries between those systems were blurred. A sailor reading the sea for direction might also listen for tone, watch for the color of clouds, or judge the feel of the air. If it reminded him of a night when Vega burned low on the horizon and a favorable wind followed, he would adjust course accordingly. Experience and instinct were not separate from the heavens, but a form of reading them. And so, as the ship moved through night water, its wake sometimes glowed with phosphorescence, tiny plankton reacting to the motion. To Renaissance eyes, this shimmer looked like stardust fallen into the sea. That glow, brief and alive, confirmed what they had always believed: that above and below were two halves of a whole. That sailing west under Sagittarius was more than strategy. It was a return, a realignment with the celestial rhythm that the sea itself remembered. The belief that the sea mirrored the heavens also extended into rituals, especially among crews departing on long voyages. In Genoese tradition, it was common for sailors to carry a star map, not made of parchment, but stitched into cloth or carved into wood. These maps didn't always match celestial charts precisely, but they reflected memory, personal constellations, as it were. Sailors traced their origins through the sky, marking which star rose when they first left home, or which one hovered overhead when a storm had passed. One such tablet survives in a museum in Palermo, its surface worn smooth by fingers, its stars faint but placed with purpose. In Iceland, fishers once sang Hafsalmar, or sea psalms, before launching into black northern waters. These chants included references to constellations, naming them as companions rather than objects. The sea and sky were not passive environments, but living structures, aware, aligned, and, if respected, protective. The Norse legacy of star-based direction also found echoes in Inuit oral histories and Polynesian canoe chants, all of which fused the heavens with the seas beneath them. Perhaps no culture carried this harmony further than the Polynesian voyagers. Though their traditions predated the Renaissance by centuries, their view of the sea as a starbound mirror remains one of the clearest expressions of the belief. Navigators in the Pacific memorized hundreds of star paths, called kavinga, that dictated not just direction but timing, season, and song. When sailing from Tahiti to Hawaii or Rarotonga to Samoa, a navigator did not use a compass. He used the vertical rise and set points of stars, aligning the canoe's prow to where a specific star would rise just above the swell. The sea, in their view, carried those stars. The ocean was not charted in ink but in rhythm. When lying down in the hull of a canoe, a master navigator could tell from the pitch of the waves whether they matched the angle of a remembered star path. The sky overhead was repeated in the water below, and the canoe itself became a line connecting both, a fin vessel drawn through mirrored infinities. This oceanic reflection wasn't abstract. It was practiced, proven, passed down. Navigators like Mau-Pielug, who in the 20th century trained a new generation of Pacific wayfinders, described learning the sea's voice through the language of stars. And while this tradition lay far outside the Renaissance worldview, its resonance is unmistakable. Different oceans, different tools, but the same belief that the sky above and the water below were not separate. They were a dialogue. Back in Europe, this philosophy persisted even as science advanced. With the invention of more precise tools, sextants, chronometers, later even marine timepieces, the idea of the sea as a mirror began to fade in professional circles. But among many mariners, it remained a quiet comfort. In logbooks well into the 1700s, captains noted still nights of mirrored stars, or described sails so calm they seemed painted in sky glass. The sea's surface, after all, does reflect. On nights without wind, a vessel could drift between constellations, suspended between two skies. For those watching from the deck, with only stars and silence around them, The sensation was not of travel, but of orbiting something vast. The water offered no resistance. The air tasted clean and wide. In such moments, the ocean felt not like a body to cross, but a threshold thin, patient, infinite. And even today, the memory of this belief remains. In satellite images, the ocean still appears as a dark band below the arc of Earth's atmosphere, lined with starlight. Astronauts report looking down and seeing the same constellations reflected in the Pacific surface, the thin white trails of ships leaving momentary streaks through what looks like sky. From above, the idea that the sea holds heaven doesn't seem quite so abstract. It feels like something we once understood but let drift from memory. There's a quote from a Portuguese journal, penned in 1602 by a ship's surgeon crossing the South Atlantic. He writes, "The men speak softly on nights like this, as if the stars are listening through the waves. They say to point the helm toward the place where the sky seems brightest in the water. I cannot argue with such things, for we have not been lost." That sentiment, quiet and trusting, sums up the mindset of the era. Not foolish, not naive, but willing to let the world speak for itself in its own way. And what the world said on those mirror-like seas was simple, that we are surrounded, above and below, by patterns waiting to be traced. That orientation is more than measurement, it is attentiveness. The stars don't just give you distance or bearing, they give you rhythm. They tell you when to rest, when to wake, when to hope. In the quiet of these long crossings, there's something profoundly human in the notion that what's above us might reflect below. That when the wind stills and the waters lie calm, we are suspended between echoes, between sky and memory, between past belief and present silence. So, if ever you find yourself standing at the edge of a shore, where the moonlight trails across the tide and the sky glimmers in salt water, remember the centuries of eyes that looked out and saw not separation, but symmetry. Remember that the world once spoke in reflections, and that to sail at all was to believe. And now, Voyager, as the candle grows low and your breath slows to match the roll of an unseen tide, let your thoughts drift where cartographers once dreamed. Let the stars arrange themselves above you, and imagine the sea beneath reflecting each point of light back upward, as if drawing you home by way of mirrored grace. Thank you for sailing with us tonight. Sleep gently, and may your bearings always be steady, whether by compass, current, or quiet constellation.